Boldwood presents Daughter of Hong Kong, written by Siobhan Daiko and read by Elizabeth Chan. Author note: the characters in this story use language appropriate to the historical period and are an accurate reflection of the era they are living in, which some readers may find upsetting. Thankfully, we now live in more enlightened times. Chapter 1. London, 17th of April, 1939. A chill wind whipped around Will as he stood on the promenade deck of the P&O liner RMS Carthage. He pulled his jacket collar up around his ears, and the purr of the ship's engines vibrated under his feet. The other passengers were leaning over the railings and holding on to multicoloured paper streamers, linking them to their loved ones on the dock below. But no one was there to see Will off, as he left to start a new life in Hong Kong. He didn't mind. He'd said goodbye to Mama, Papa, and his little brother Jeremy earlier that day at Temple Meads in Bristol. Too much of a palaver for them to journey to London with him, Papa had said. He'd added that, at 23 years of age, Will was independent enough to cope with getting himself and his luggage to Tilbury on his own. 4 deep blasts resounded from the ship's horn, and a thrill coursed through Will. 2 sailors were casting off the ropes, and a pair of tugs, their dirty smokestacks caked with brine, began to nudge the Carthage out into the middle of the Thames. The streamers linking his fellow passengers to the people on the quay below snapped, and Will gazed at the docks receding into the distance while the liner headed into the estuary. He breathed in the fresh sea air. The subtle whisper of an exotic perfume, with hints of jasmine if he wasn't mistaken, wafted towards him. He glanced around for the source of the scent. A lone young woman was turning away from the railings. Bundled up in a navy woolen coat with a bright red scarf around her neck, her long dark brown hair lashed by the wind, she brushed past him and strode in the direction of the doors to the first-class lounge. Will stepped into the salon to look for her. He took a step back. The room was just like the dining hall of a baronial lodge in Scotland. Fireplace, panelled roof, leather armchairs, crossed tapers on the wall, and a mounted stag's head. But it was empty apart from a man in a tweed suit who was sitting reading a newspaper. Will shrugged and went down to his cabin. Later, after unpacking, Will slipped on his dinner jacket and checked his reflection in the mirror above the basin in his private bathroom, simply fitted with a shower and a WC. He adjusted his black tie and made sure his cufflinks were in place. How lucky he was to have fallen on his feet like this. He'd been recruited as a cadet in the colonial service after his graduation last summer in classics at University College, Oxford. He'd subsequently taken a training course in London. At his interview, he'd said he'd grown up reading Kipling and had been inspired by Robert Louis Stevenson's poem about a young boy who'd wanted to travel to China. There I'll come when I'm a man, with a camel caravan. Will remembered the words he'd memorised when he was a 10-year-old, words that still resonated with him, although lately he'd been enjoying the more adult Far Eastern tales and travelogues of Somerset Maugham, which had whetted his appetite for life in the Orient even more. His interviewer, a brittle middle-aged man from the Colonial Office, had pointed out that the British Empire stretched around the globe. Besides India, the largest colonies were in Africa, and in the east, the most important outposts were in Ceylon, Malaya, Sarawak, and North Borneo, and wouldn't Will have preferred to have gone there? But Will had declined. China called to him, and that's where he was heading. He stepped back into his well-appointed single cabin, furnished with an actual bed, not a bunk, and boasting a chest of drawers and a desk. He was travelling in the height of luxury to his dream job. One qualm niggled, however. He'd struggled with the speaking skills element of the initial Cantonese course he'd been required to take during his training. He'd never imagined it would be so difficult for someone of his acclaimed linguistic abilities. But Chinese didn't use an alphabetical writing system like Latin, in which he excelled. Instead, Chinese used characters that were composed of parts that depicted physical objects or abstract ideas, and there were no concrete rules for how a character should be pronounced based on its appearance. He'd had to turn everything he thought he knew about language learning on its head. What made Chinese even more different was the fact that it was a tonal language. The meaning of a word could change, depending on the pitch that was used, even if the pronunciation was the same. To make matters even worse, there were 6 tones in the Cantonese spoken in Hong Kong, compared with 4 in Mandarin. It had made him almost want to tear his hair out. But he was determined to get to grips with it, and he hoped that, once he was in the colony, where he would be immersed in the language, he'd find it easier to learn. Adjusting his cufflinks again, Will peered out of the porthole of his cabin at the dark sea below. The wind had dropped, and the channel, reflecting the moonlight, was as calm as a mill pond. No doubt the Carthage would encounter rougher conditions as it made its way through the Bay of Biscay and onwards. He turned away. The ship was much smaller than he'd expected. He'd imagined a floating castle like the more glamorous Queen Mary. Instead, the Carthage was much lower in the water. She would probably roll about a lot in big seas. But Will wasn't concerned. He was a good sailor and had never been seasick when he'd taken part in sailing events at school. The brassy sound of the dinner gong echoed through his door, and his stomach rumbled with sudden hunger. He left his cabin and stepped into the passageway leading to the dining room. The carpet felt soft beneath the soles of his dress shoes as he breathed in the aroma of fresh paint and polish. He remembered the subtle perfume of the woman he'd noticed earlier. The look of her small, yet perfect form had made him wish he'd seen her face, and he hoped he would bump into her again. The trip to Hong Kong would take over a month, and it might be amusing to pass the time in the company of a woman. Will chuckled to himself. Fat chance of a shipboard romance. He was no Romeo, and he had a poor track record as far as girls were concerned. As soon as they found out his ambitions lay on the other side of the world, they ran a mile. At the entrance to the spacious dining room, a waiter assigned him to a round table with 12 chairs, and Will introduced himself to the 9 people already present. He took his seat and regarded his fellow guests. On his left sat the Hendersons, a quiet young couple who were heading as far as Bombay, where the husband would take up a post in the Indian Civil Service. They were chatting to an Australian called Carter, who'd spent 4 years at Cambridge and was going home to his family in Melbourne, catching an onward connection from Hong Kong. To Will's right sat 2 chaps of about his age, Atkinson and Webb, who were joining the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. To their right was another couple, the Bakers, also travelling to Hong Kong, where Mr. Baker would work for Jardine Matheson. The final couple were older, Harry Wynne-Jones and his red-headed wife, Margaret. Harry was Director of Medical Services in Hong Kong, he explained, and they were returning to the colony after a period of leave in England. Their waiter arrived with a tureen of soup and began ladling out portions, so Will presumed the final 2 seats would be taken by passengers joining the ship from a later port. He lowered his head and took a spoonful of the chicken broth. The unmistakable scent he'd encountered earlier made him glance up. The girl who'd walked past him that afternoon had pulled out a chair. She was dressed in a stunning pale grey silk cheongsam, but she wasn't Chinese. Her beautiful almond-shaped oriental eyes shone brightly in a face with delicate European features, bearing witness to a mixed heritage. "Good evening," she said politely. "Sorry to be late to dinner. My name is Constance Han, Connie for short." She indicated a buxom woman with frizzy grey hair who'd come up from behind. "This is Gloria, my old governess, who's travelling back to Hong Kong with me." "Not so much of the old, young lady," the woman said, laughing. She shook hands around the table. "There's plenty of spark in me yet, or I wouldn't have the energy to look after Connie's nieces and nephews." "I know your father," Harry said to Connie. delighted to make the acquaintance of his daughter. His youngest daughter, Connie clarified. I've missed my family so much and can't wait to return. 3 years studying in England has seemed like a lifetime. Were you up at university? Harry asked. I read English at King's in London. She spooned soup into her mouth, then dabbed with a starched napkin. Connie has just graduated with a first, Gloria chipped in. We're so proud of her. All thanks to you teaching me such good speaking and listening skills, Connie said. Will had already noticed she spoke without any trace of a Chinese accent. He longed to ask her more about herself, but that would have been impolite. Conversations soon turned to the Spanish Civil War ending and Adolf Hitler's latest shenanigans in Europe. Margaret expressed her worry about Chamberlain offering a guarantee of the independence of Poland. She added that she hoped there wouldn't be another war. The last one was meant to be the war that ended all wars, she said. Not going to come to that, dear girl. Harry patted her hand. No more doom and gloom. Let's talk of more pleasant things. Which was what they did, in solid British fashion, discussing the weather, the king, and the 2 young princesses, and then the film, Marco Polo, which Mrs. Baker had thought spectacular. She was quickly disabused of her opinion by the rest of the table. Hollywoodian make-believe, Gloria declared, and everyone else agreed with her. Will had seen the movie and thought it was lacking in action. After coffee, the ladies went to their cabins while the men retired to the smoking lounge. Nursing a glass of port and a cigar, Will sat back in a leather armchair and shot Harry Wynne-Jones a glance. Connie Han seems like an interesting person, he said, with deliberate casualness. You said you know her father? She's the daughter of Sir Albert Han Fung, a multimillionaire Eurasian businessman. They live on the Peak. Harry blew out cigar smoke. The only non-European family allowed to live up there. What do you mean by allowed to live up there? Will leant forward in his chair. It's strictly for whites, dear boy. Not that I agree with the ruling, far from it. Margaret and I consider ourselves reformers, and would like to see places like the Peak opened up to everyone. He shook his head. Sir Albert was already living there when the law was introduced. His co-wife thought it would be healthier for their children. His co-wife? Will couldn't help his jaw dropping. He has more than one wife. Harry nodded. Albert Han Fung's first wife, Ada, was unable to have children, but he loved her and decided not to divorce her. Instead, he proposed to adopt the firstborn child of his Chinese concubine instead. After years of trying for a baby, the concubine gave birth to a daughter. Knowing how much Albert wanted a son, Ada persuaded her maternal cousin Grace to accept him as co-wife. Grace later gave birth to 2 sons and 4 daughters. Connie is the youngest. Harry smirked, taking in Will's expression. You look shocked. Isn't that bigamous? Bigamy is perfectly legal in Chinese society and tradition. Despite being of mixed ethnicity, Sir Albert considers himself fully Chinese, which is also reflected in his way of dressing in traditional long robes. He was knighted after representing Hong Kong at an exhibition in London, an occasion in which he was able to meet Queen Mary, but his allegiances are all with China. Ah, Will responded, not knowing what else to say. There was much he'd have to learn about Hong Kong's peculiarities, that was for sure. He knocked back the rest of his port and put out his cigar. I'll bid you good night then, he said. Good night, dear boy. Harry waved him off. In his cabin, Will changed into pyjamas, used the bathroom, then climbed into bed. But sleep eluded him. His mind was in too much of a whirl. Words chased each other through his head, and the only way to settle them would be to get them down on paper. Writing poetry was his way of making sense of the world, a pastime he kept to himself. Will didn't consider his efforts worthy of public scrutiny, but they were as essential to him as breathing. He went to the desk and retrieved his writing case from the drawer, where he'd stowed it earlier. He took out a sheet of paper and wrote, "I met a girl, with eastern eyes under western skies. But soon it will be, my western eyes under her eastern skies. What lies before me, I ask myself." Absolute rubbish, he thought, screwing up the piece of paper. He returned to bed, staring at the darkness through the porthole, and saw Connie Han's beautiful eyes shining back at him, her delicate smile as she dabbed at her lips with her napkin. He couldn't help smiling now. Perhaps he'd have another try at that poem tomorrow. Chapter 2. Connie lay in the luxurious two-bedded cabin she shared with Gloria, the rumble of her old governess's snores keeping her awake. She thought about the passengers she'd met that evening. While they were getting ready for bed, Gloria had told her that a friend of hers was a nurse at the Queen Mary Hospital on Hong Kong Island, and this friend had gossiped about Margaret Wynne-Jones. Apparently, the Director of Medical Services' wife was known as Red Margaret. Connie responded that Margaret's hair was the reddest she'd ever seen, but Gloria had laughed and said the nickname wasn't because of the colour of Margaret's hair, but because of her left-wing sympathies. Connie had expressed surprise. Her first impressions of the redhead were of a do-gooder rather than a left-winger. Connie sighed to herself. She'd encountered left-wingers while at university. A fellow student had tried to persuade her to join a communist group. At the time, she'd made the excuse she wasn't interested in politics, which wasn't true, as she'd been following developments in mainland China since she was old enough to understand them. Father had donated generously to Dr. Sun Yat-sen's campaigns to establish the Republic of China well before she was born, and he was now an ardent supporter of his successor, the nationalist, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who was fervently anti-communist and whose troops were fighting them. In fact, Connie's brother Matthew was a commander in the Nationalist Army and fought against both the communists and the Japanese. Connie supported the Chinese nationalists as well, so she kept out of left-wing politics in London and took a first aid course instead, spending her free time doing volunteer work with the St. John's Ambulance Association. With the thrum of the Carthage's engines vibrating through her mattress, Connie rolled over in bed and turned her thoughts to Will Burton, the young man she'd met at dinner. Dashingly handsome, with light brown wavy hair and vibrant indigo blue eyes. She'd found out in conversation that he was a cadet in the colonial service. Connie remembered Father telling her about the cadets when she'd asked him how Hong Kong was governed. He'd said they were cardboard cutouts of each other. All came from solid, though not rich, upper-middle-class families and had studied at public schools, though not the most prestigious. They generally attended one of the older universities, where they read classics or history, and stood out for their application to study and for their interest in sport. Cadets came into the colonial service with many shared beliefs about attitudes toward the communities they were to govern, a stance they'd learned from their backgrounds and public school education. They were groomed to rule the people and protect them from local and foreign injustice while living apart from them, whether at home or abroad. Connie fully expected Will to conform to that archetype. She would have nothing in common with him, which was perfectly all right as far as she was concerned. Connie had kept herself to herself in London, and she would do the same on the voyage home. She couldn't wait to return to her own environment and to catch up with her extended family. With a self-deprecating sigh, the thought occurred to her that she wasn't unlike the British cadets she'd been so quick to disparage. Everyone felt more comfortable with what was familiar to them. It was only natural. The Carthage gave a sudden roll, jolting her into awareness of a different reality. Oh God, she thought, the sea had turned rough. She'd suffered from terrible seasickness on the journey out to England. Nausea swelled in her stomach and filled her throat. She leapt out of bed and ran to the bathroom, only making it just in time before she was violently sick. "How are you feeling this morning?" Gloria asked Connie a week or so later, pouring her a cup of tea in their cabin. "You're looking a little brighter." "A lot better, thanks." Connie sipped her drink and glanced out of the porthole at the sandy banks of the Suez Canal. "Perhaps I've got my sea legs at last." "You should go up on deck, get some fresh air. You've been closeted far too long." "I couldn't keep much down, you know." Connie shook her head. "It was the same on the outward voyage 4 years ago. My tummy took ages before it could manage anything other than toast." Gloria patted her arm. "Shame you missed experiencing port side." "Oh, I was well enough to do that on the way out. I'll never forget the gully man." The Egyptian magician had come on board dressed in a long robe, a red tarbouche with a tassel on his head. She'd travelled with Mother that time. Gloria had started looking after Connie's sister Mary's children in Hong Kong and wasn't due any leave yet. The magician's special trick, relying solely on sleight of hand, had been to produce baby chicks from behind passengers' ears, their mouths and the back of their knees, all the while intoning "Gully, gully." He was very entertaining. Gloria placed her teacup on the table. "Well, I'm off to the lounge to meet the ladies from our dinner table for a bridge rubber. I hope I'll see you in the dining room at lunchtime, my dear." "I hope so too." After Gloria had bustled off, Connie dressed herself in shorts and a blouse. She slipped on a pair of espadrilles, grabbed her sun hat, and made her way up the companionway to the promenade deck. Hot wind hit her like a slap in the face. On shaky legs, she went to the railings and clung onto them, taking in deep breaths. The light was almost blinding after spending so long in the gloom of her cabin, and she wished she'd brought her dark glasses. She shaded her eyes with a hand and squinted at the scenery. Empty desert surrounded the banks of the canal, then man-made waterway connecting the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. She turned to look towards where the Carthage was heading, but a sudden gust lifted her hat from her head and sent it tumbling along the deck. Her head spinning, Connie chased after it. A man was lounging on a deck chair. He rose, grabbed hold of the hat, and held it out as she approached him. She recognised Will Burton and smiled. "Thank you so much. I'm so sorry to disturb you." She glanced at the notebook he'd left on his chair. "Were you working?" "Just doing a bit of writing." He gave her a warm smile. "It's good to see you up and about. Gloria told us you'd been suffering from seasickness." "It's terribly annoying to be a bad sailor." She wobbled on her feet. "Sorry, but I need to sit down. The strength has gone from my legs." Concern flashed in his vivid blue eyes. He indicated the deck chair next to his. "Lower yourself gently." She did as he'd suggested, gratefully accepting the pillow he handed her to place behind her head. "I'll go and fetch you a glass of water." He set off for the first-class lounge. She glanced at the open page of the notebook and couldn't help reading the words. "There, beneath the waves, she sleeps. Who would dare to raise her from the deep? Neptune's bride, a mermaid from the east." Was Will a poet? She didn't want to appear nosy, so she couldn't ask him outright. She kept her gaze averted from the page as he returned with the water. "Here you are." Will gave her the glass. "Sip it slowly, or you might feel sick again." He shut the notebook and perched on his deck chair while she drank. The sandy banks of the canal were giving way to the higher, more rugged ground of the Sinai Peninsula, and the small, whitewashed town of Suez glistened in the searing desert heat. She inhaled the scent borne on the wind. "I love the smell." "The smell?" Will quirked a brow. "It's the smell of the Orient. People, exotic foods, spices. In Hong Kong, it's mixed with the scent of joss sticks." She took a big breath, then released it. "I've missed this smell so much." "It must have been hard for you to be away from your home." He looked her in the eye. "Why did you go to university in England, if you don't mind my asking?" "I wanted to go to the University of Hong Kong, but as I was considered Chinese, I needed to have taken the Chinese entrance exam. My mother had sent me to an English-speaking school, so I gained entrance to a British university instead. Don't you speak Chinese? Oh yes, I'm bilingual. I grew up speaking it with the servants at home, and I can read and write it fluently. But if I'd wanted to stay in Hong Kong, it would have meant me going to Chinese school for a couple of more years to prepare for the test. I persuaded my parents to let me study in England instead. She put down her glass. Where did you go to school, Will? He told her he'd attended Clifton College in Bristol, before going up to Oxford, where he'd read classics. She couldn't resist a wry smile that he conformed to the archetype. Except, perhaps, there was something about him. Something different. Might it be the poetry? She itched to ask him about it, but didn't want to confess to having read what he'd written. If, indeed, it had been he who had written it. I read English at King's, she said. I love the romantic poets, especially Wordsworth. We poets in our youth begin in gladness, but thereof comes in the end despondency and madness, he quoted. They certainly took themselves extremely seriously. What made you join the colonial service? She'd given him the chance to admit to being a poet, but he hadn't taken it. He must have had a good reason for that, so she decided not to probe and had changed the subject instead. I couldn't envisage a life spent commuting to and from a job in England. China's always fascinated me. His brow furrowed. Except now I have to learn Chinese and, to be honest, I'm finding the speaking element extremely difficult. Are you musical? I mean, can you perceive differences in musical pitch? I can sing a tune accurately, I think. I was in the choir at school. But why? Is it because of the tones? So you know about them? He nodded. I was given a taster course in London. Once in Hong Kong, I will need to master speaking Cantonese completely before I can start in my first posting. It's a little daunting, to say the least. I can give you some lessons if you like. Why would you want to do that? I don't mean to come across as ungrateful. He sounded incredulous. She'd made the offer spontaneously, without thinking about it. Will had revealed something about himself, a vulnerability that had touched her, and she wanted to help. It would be a way for me to pass time on the journey, and it might give you more confidence, she said. Thank you, Connie. A smile brushed his lips. I'm happy to accept. She glanced away from him, suddenly shy. The call of seagulls rippled through the air, and she rose to her feet. She made her way to the railings, and he followed her. There they stood and gazed at the sea. A manatee broke the smooth surface, making kissing sounds with its bearded mouth, and a flamboyance of pink flamingos flapped past. How beautiful, Will said. The word enchanting popped into Connie's head, and she wondered if he would write a poem about the birds. Chapter 3. After dinner, Will waltzed Margaret across the polished parquet floor to the tune of Blue Danube, played by the ship's band. Dancing on board the Carthage took place in a separate area to the dining room. The folding double doors, opening onto the forward sports deck, let in the cool night air, and he caught the scent of Connie's jasmine perfume as she glided past, partnered by Harry. Will was glad she'd stayed to dance. Earlier, after lunch, she'd retired to her cabin, pleading tiredness when Will had suggested a game of deck quoits. I'm not very good at it, she'd added, but I'd love to play when I'm feeling stronger. I'll look forward to it, he'd said. Of course she was tired. She'd only just recovered from seasickness and needed to regain her strength. He'd played and beaten both the Hong Kong bank boys, Atkinson and Webb, in separate matches. Then he'd gone for a dip in the plunge pool and had dried off on the sun deck before heading down to his cabin to dress for dinner. The meal had seemed interminable while he'd waited for the dancing to start. He'd hoped Connie would linger. He couldn't wait to twirl her around the floor. Until that night, he'd partnered with Gloria and the married women at his table. Atkinson and Webb, together with Carter, the Australian, had danced with the single ladies at other tables, who Harry had described as being part of the ubiquitous fishing fleet, girls who travelled to India, Singapore or Hong Kong and stayed with friends or relatives while they fished for a husband. But Will hadn't been able to summon up any interest in the unmarried Englishwomen on board the Carthage. All he'd thought about had been Connie's beautiful eyes and her captivating smile. He wanted to get to know her, wanted to find out if her personality was as attractive as her looks. And that morning, when she'd offered to help him practice speaking Cantonese, she'd revealed herself to be as lovely as he'd hoped she would be. The singer switched to "The Way You Look Tonight," and Margaret said she'd sit the dance out. Harry and Connie were heading back to their table, and Will seized his chance. "Would you do me the honour, Connie?" he asked with a bow. The lyrics could have been written to describe how she looked that night. She was so beautiful, Will thought, as he led her into a foxtrot. She placed one hand on his shoulder and the other in his hand, the short sleeves of her pale blue silk cheongsam revealing her slender upper arms. And it occurred to him that her warm smile and tickling laugh had touched his foolish heart, just like the words of the song. Soon he was dancing her through the open doors onto the deck. Above them, the moon cut a sliver of silver in a sky that billowed with stars. She faltered, and he asked if she needed a rest. "Just a short one," she said, "while I get my breath back." They found a deck chair and shared it, sitting next to each other on the footrest, while the soft night air soothed them. He offered her a cigarette, a Player's, which she accepted. She cupped his hand while he lit it, so the breeze wouldn't blow out the match. "I don't usually smoke," she admitted with a slight cough. Will found an ashtray, then lit his own cigarette and took a deep draw. He was about to ask her about his first Cantonese lesson when Gloria bustled out onto the deck. "Oh, there you are, Connie," she huffed. "You shouldn't be staying up so late. You've only just got better." Connie put out her cigarette. She bent her head to Will's, while her old governess went back inside. "Meet me in the library after breakfast for your first lesson," she whispered. "Gloria will be playing bridge then." "Must you go?" "I'd better. Father asked Gloria to keep an eye on me." Alone on the sports deck, Will tapped the ash from his cigarette. Connie clearly followed the 3,000-year-old Chinese philosophy of filial duty, or shao. Will remembered learning about China's arguably most important moral tenet. Children were required to defer to their parents and other elders in the family, even when they themselves became adults. And, given that the family was considered the building block of society, the hierarchical system of respect also applied by extension to the country and rulers of China. It was vital that Will understood the concept of shao, he was told on his course in London, as it would be paramount in his dealings with the Chinese. He took a final drag from his cigarette, exhaled a puff of smoke, and stubbed it out. With a sigh of resignation, he rose from the deck chair and returned to the entertainment centre for a nightcap before he went to bed. "In Chinese we have no big words," Connie said to Will the next morning at the table they'd purloined in the ship's library. "And all our words are composed of only one syllable. Do you know how many words can be made that are no longer than a syllable?" Will thought for a moment. "A couple of hundred, I suppose?" "Correct. About 400. That doesn't seem enough to make a whole language, does it?" No, I wouldn't have thought so. In Chinese, because we use only monosyllables, we use tones to add to the syllables and create more words. Foreigners trying to learn our language often find the tones intimidating, but they need not be so. You also use tones in English, by the way." "We do?" "Of course." Her laugh tinkled, and Will couldn't help smiling. "Think about the words, 'you came.' The significance is not the same as 'you came.' One is a statement, the other is a question. The difference is the tone." "How enlightening." In Chinese, we use tones in a structured way, she went on. The meaning of a word is conveyed by the monosyllable and its tone together. He nodded slowly that he understood, more or less. Every word pronounced in Cantonese has 6 tones, so 400 monosyllables times 6 tones make 2,400. Extremely easy compared to English, she smiled. Do you know how many words there are in your language? He shook his head sheepishly. He was a poet. Perhaps this was something he should know. Over 170,000. Gosh, so many. I would never have guessed. Although maybe it's easier to remember separate words than to memorize 6 tones for every word. A frown creased her brow. You were putting obstacles in your way before you've started. You said you were musical, so you will have no problem. For instance, go-go, go-go. Come again? It means that big brother. Go-go and go-go. Can you hear the difference? Go-go means that one, and go-go means big brother. There are 9 sounds and 6 tones in Cantonese. You must raise, maintain, or lower the pitch of your voice to sing each word. Si, for example, can mean poem, history, try, time, market, or to be, depending on the tone. Listen to me and repeat. Connie's tone of voice and pitch varied for each word. They carried on with the lesson for about an hour, Will practicing and making copious notes in his pad. As soon as he'd mastered one word, Connie moved on to the next. I think I've pushed you hard enough for now, she said finally. Let's take a break. I thought you'd never ask, he chuckled. My brain feels as if it's about to explode. She laughed again. How about we go up on deck for some fresh air? Perfect. Standing at the ship's railings, Connie gazed down at the sea. Are you a good swimmer, Will? I like to think that I am. I swam for my school in Bristol and then for University College, Oxford. How about you? I'm all right in a pool, but I'm terrified of swimming in the sea. Why is that? We used to motor to one of Hong Kong's outlying islands on Father's launch when I was little, so we could swim off the quieter beaches. One time, when I was 10, I was swimming back to the launch when I saw a shark's fin surface right next to me. It was terrifying, and since then, I haven't been able to bring myself to go back into the sea. Every summer, there are shark attacks in Hong Kong. He caught the fear in her eyes. She abruptly turned away. It's nearly lunchtime. Let's go and have a drink in the bar. We can wait for the others there before going through to the dining room. Sounds like an excellent plan, he said. Will met Connie every morning in the library while Gloria played bridge. He hadn't been surprised when Connie had told him she'd confessed to Gloria she was teaching him Cantonese. Connie's sense of filial duty would have prompted her to be straightforward, and evidently, Gloria had wished her well with the task. Will couldn't help thinking that was because they were in full view of everyone. Their moments alone were few and far between, and Will had to resign himself to the fact that Gloria took her responsibilities seriously, keeping an eye on Connie as instructed by Sir Albert. Perhaps, once he and Connie were in Hong Kong, there would be opportunities for him to see her alone. She was enchanting, and he wanted to take things further, provided she felt the same way. In the meantime, he had to content himself with her being his teacher. Connie made vocabulary cards for him, the English word on one side, the Chinese word, spelt out phonetically, on the other. Sometimes she gave him on-the-spot tests to ensure he remembered what she'd taught him, which could be quite daunting. But he was eager to learn and enjoyed the lessons immensely. Not only was he gradually getting to grips with the language, but his sessions with Connie allowed him to spend time in her charming company. Soon, Connie said she was feeling up to playing deckquoits in the afternoon. She was right about not being that good at the game, but Will was delighted to partner her in a tournament and didn't mind at all when they lost to Webb and Atkinson. Just the sight of her determined expression as she lobbed the rope rings at the target gladdened his heart. They docked in Bombay to let off passengers and take on new ones. There, they said goodbye to the Hendersons. After the peace of the long days at sea, the city appeared overcrowded and dirty. There wasn't time to go ashore, and Will was relieved when they set sail again. He couldn't wait to resume his morning lessons, afternoon deck quoits, and evenings spent dancing under the stars. As they sailed further south, the heat increased exponentially, and the fierce sun became ever more relentless. At night, Will opened the porthole of his cabin to cool down his sweat-drenched body. All par for the course, he thought. It would be even hotter in Hong Kong, and at least he was getting somewhat acclimatised. He and his fellow first-class male passengers switched from black dinner jackets to white in the evenings, and the ladies put on flimsier gowns. Connie wore sleeveless cheongsams made of soft linen instead of silk brocade. They were shorter than those she'd worn at the start of the voyage. The slits at the sides presumably made them cooler, and he liked the fact that they revealed more of her long, slender legs. In Singapore, Connie and Gloria were whisked off by one of Sir Albert's friends, who took them out for lunch at Raffles Hotel. Will had to content himself with exploring on his own. He went to the Chinese Quarter and tested his spoken Cantonese in a herbalist's shop, where he bought a jar of tiger balm ointment. It was gratifying to have been able to communicate and to have understood what the shopkeeper said to him. Back on board, during his lesson the following morning, he told Connie about the sense of achievement he'd felt, and she said she was proud of him. Now they were only a day away from arriving in Hong Kong, and Will still hadn't kissed her. There'd been many occasions when he'd wanted to, but Gloria watched Connie like an overbearing hawk. Tonight, however, Gloria had stayed down in the cabin she shared with Connie. She'd eaten something at lunchtime that had upset her stomach, apparently. So Will hoped he'd get his chance. After partnering the other ladies at the table, he quick-stepped Connie around the floor to the tune of Puttin' on the Ritz, then led her out onto the sports deck to cool off. They sat next to each other on the footstool of a deck chair. "I'll miss dancing with you, Will," she said, staring into the distance. "Why? I'm hoping I'll be able to take you dancing in Hong Kong." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "Hasn't anyone told you about how life is there?" "What do you mean?" "I cannot be seen with you." "Why ever not?" He couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "I cannot be seen with a European man on my own. It would ruin my chances of making a good Chinese marriage." Will's heart sank. What if you decided not to marry a Chinese? What if you decided to marry an Englishman? "I'm afraid that could never happen. Girls from my background don't marry Europeans, only girls from the lower classes." A sinking feeling came over him. "Let me get this right. You're telling me this is it? That we won't be able to see each other once we've arrived in Hong Kong?" "I'm sorry." She placed her hand on his arm. "You'll soon find out how things are done. I expect one of the first things you'll be told is not to get involved with a local girl. I'm sure you'll be invited to parties where you'll meet many highly suitable women." "But I don't want to meet anyone else, Connie, now I've met you." He sounded devastated, and he was. She gazed at him, her beautiful eyes deep pools of regret. He lifted his hand and stroked her soft cheek. He couldn't help himself, so warm and lovely. He leant in and kissed her gently on the mouth. She pulled back with a gasp. "I'm sorry," he murmured, horrified with himself for acting so rashly. But then she lifted her face and pressed her lips to his, and he kissed her properly, and she kissed him back. She broke off and looked intensely into his eyes, her hands on the sides of his face. "I'd better go down to my cabin." "You can't not see me in Hong Kong, not after kissing me like that, Connie." He returned her gaze. It will be very difficult. Are you sure this is what you want? We'd only be able to meet in secret. I cannot openly defy my parents. It would go against everything I believe in. I understand. He breathed a heavy sigh. But I can't envisage my life without you in it, however limited. Besides, you're my teacher, aren't you? I need you to keep teaching me Cantonese. You will have excellent teachers provided by the colonial service. Ah, but they won't be as good as you. She gazed into the distance again, then turned back to him. There is one place where we could meet, maybe, from time to time. The Botanical Gardens behind Government House. It isn't far from the Peak Tram station, which I use when I come down to the Central District. But how will I know when to meet you? It struck him that Connie was being deliberately vague. I will find a way to get in touch with you somehow. Can't I telephone you even? She chewed on her lip. Better not. I'll phone the Colonial Secretariat and leave a message for you. Would that be all right? I suppose so. She brushed a quick kiss to his cheek. Good night, Will. Without another word, she got to her feet and made her way back indoors, the subtle scent of her perfume lingering in her wake. Will lit a cigarette and took a draw. How could this have happened? He'd fallen for a girl who was seemingly beyond his reach. He should have known better, should have found out more about the social norms in Hong Kong. Connie was the daughter of Sir Albert Han Fung, a powerful man by all accounts. He would have to tread very carefully once he arrived in the colony. He wouldn't give up on her, though. Her kiss had spoken more than words ever could. Chapter 4. Connie was standing on the foredeck with Will beside her. They'd come up straight after breakfast to take in the sights as the Carthage entered the western approaches to Hong Kong. She'd been a little awkward with him at the table. She'd spent practically the entire night tossing and turning and thinking about him. It had come as a shock when he'd asked her if he could take her out dancing. She'd thought he knew about the colony's social norms, and she'd felt terrible about having to turn him down. His face, a picture of dejection, had made her want to weep. When he'd kissed her, she hadn't wanted him to stop, and so she'd recklessly kissed him back. What had gotten into her? She'd never behaved in such an uncontrolled fashion before in her life. And now she'd promised to carry on seeing him. In the Botanical Gardens, of all places. The location had popped into her head on the spur of the moment. How very irresponsible of her. She wiped perspiration from her brow with a handkerchief. The day had turned hot and sticky already. While they were sipping their morning coffee, Harry had conveyed the information that the temperature was 92 degrees with 93% humidity. Typical of Hong Kong in May. Connie's dress clung to her, and her nipples swelled uncomfortably against the rayon satin of her brassiere. Sweat gathered not only between her breasts, but also in the place between her thighs she always thought of as down there. She'd never known such intense awareness of her body before this voyage. She'd become profoundly conscious of being a woman basking in the admiration of a man. Connie, there it is, just over the horizon. You can see a shape below the clouds, the voice of said man exclaimed. Oh, yes, indeed, Will. In the distance, a plume of smoke rose, and the dark shapes of what she could barely make out as small craft bobbed beneath the elongated, vertical shadows of their sails. She smiled, breathing in familiar odours mixed with the clean tang of the sea, wood smoke, incense, cooking spices and condiments. Islands then appeared, some barren grey, others richly green, rising from the depths as the wind dispersed the early morning mist. The Carthage was gliding through a narrow channel. On the left, a cliff loomed at the edge of a big landmass. Is that Hong Kong Island? Will asked. Or is it mainland China? Neither, she answered. That's Lantau, which means Rocky Mount, bigger than Hong Kong. It's our biggest island. The Portuguese, who settled Macau over 400 years ago, called all these islands the ladrones, thieves. They were home to pirates until the British began clearing them out. The big thieves driving out the little thieves. She gave an ironic laugh. Disorganised Chinese thieving gave way to organised English thieving. It sounds as if you're anti-British, Connie. Is that so? Not at all. She shook her head. I was born in Hong Kong, and consequently I have a British passport. But the British have done dreadful deeds here, despite having also done magnificent things. Dreadful deeds and magnificent things. Yes, both. Hong Kong was a barren, fever-ridden island of a few hundred fishermen and pirates. The English turned it into a great port. But the mansions you'll see aren't built on rock. They're built on the addictive juice of the opium poppy. She shuddered. Ah, yes. I learnt about the opium wars on my course in London. It must have been a bitter pill for China to swallow, having to cede the territory of Hong Kong to British control and open treaty ports on the mainland for foreigners to trade from. The Chinese government was forced to stand by while the British turned their people into opium addicts. They did this in the name of free trade and without any thought of the consequences. Connie frowned. She didn't want to mention that her father and men like him had taken full advantage of the trading opportunities. It was a topic she would explore with Will later, if at all. Not everyone in Britain supported the opium trade, he said. Let's not speak of this now. We are approaching Hong Kong harbour. I'll point out the landmarks to you, she said, quickly changing the subject. This wasn't the time nor the place for such a heavy discussion. The grey shape on the horizon had turned into an island studded with irregular hills around a summit. That's Victoria Peak, she indicated, where I live. It's beautiful. The Carthage was sailing past a tiny shrub-covered isle now, with a whitewashed lighthouse on top and two small houses clinging to its slopes. And that's Green Island, Connie said. Very pretty. She pointed to where, on Hong Kong Island itself, rows of tenements built of bamboo, wood and woven reeds descended in tiers like ramshackle steps to the harbour's edge. That's the Western District, Sai Wan. It's mostly inhabited by poor Chinese. Fascinating, Will exclaimed. Oh my goodness. Look. Ahead, the harbour was forested with masts. The blunt masts of steamers, light grey tripod mini Eiffel Tower-shaped masts of naval ships, and the masts of a multitude of wooden Chinese junks. The latter always reminded Connie of high-pooped galleons skittering between the other vessels under their tattered patchwork sails, quilts of stained yellow.